Fantastic. And I'll go ahead and share my screen. So thank you everyone for joining our webinar today, all around focusing on Cisco DNA Center and DNA Spaces for return to the office. My name is James Gallardi. I'm a product sales specialist focusing on Cisco's DNA Center, and I'm joined by four fantastic gentlemen who along today will give some great content out there. This includes Nick Halvegas, product sales specialist for DNA Spaces, Brian Jackson, Cisco's business solutions architect. We're lucky enough to be joined by Kieran Karki, Cisco IT Customer Success Manager, and Mark McCherry, IT Director at IPTel. And from a agenda perspective, we'll open up with Brian Jackson talking about living in the new norm, a look at the resilient distributed enterprise and Cisco DNA in the new way. We will look at how DNA Center and DNA Spaces can provide a safe return to the office and provide the great experience. And then Kieran will join and talk about how Cisco IT is leveraging this technology, DNA Spaces and DNA Center, for our own return to the office across Australia and New Zealand. And then Mark will also talk about some of these examples in the real world. And that said, I will stop my screen and I will share the ball to Jacko. There you go. Jacko?
Thank you, James. And thank you all. And as James has said, I'm going to talk to you today about the broader perspective of achieving business resilience in this new normal. And certainly today, whilst we are going to spend a lot of the time around DNA Center in the context of the pandemic and return to office, I'm going to talk from the context of just looking prior to the pandemic and indeed looking forward. And that will give us this full spectrum view of where our IT transitions need to occur and how our strategy needs to align towards something that goes beyond the pandemic. Indeed, if we first look backwards and look prior to the pandemic, 7 out of 10 organizations had already experienced severe disruptions, whether they be human-centered, human-caused disruptions like cyber attacks, or whether they be natural disasters, floods, hurricanes, bushfires that we've seen here in Victoria and in other parts of the country. Social unrest is becoming more and more of a problem. It's becoming clear that as these other kinds of crises become part of our new normal, we need to look beyond business continuance from the perspective of the pandemic and look to a new culture and indeed mindset of business resilience. And I'll come back to that mindset in a few moments. But then if we look beyond the pandemic, and I'm talking here about building a resilient distributed enterprise to drive hyper innovation. Now, I personally don't like these buzzwords like hyper innovation, but when you look at what we have achieved as an industry, when you look at what you have achieved inside your organization inside the last number of months, and if you look at the changes of behaviors, whether it's around contactless payments, contactless offices, you're looking at ticketless systems, the new role of wearables, the integration of so many digital systems, all in such a short time, I think the term hyper-innovation is absolutely apt. And it's critical that we think about that those organizations that adapt this mindset of moving forward on hyper-innovation will be best positioned to take maximum benefit beyond the pandemic itself. So I've talked about this mindset, and really when you look at developing a strategy, I certainly always start with principles. And some of these really core principles and part of this mindset are really, really important, because whilst many of us have delivered adequate services to get us through the pandemic, delivering over and above that and achieving that differentiated platform of hyper innovation going forward needs a broader perspective. So these principles may help you. I'm really just going to talk about two on the left and on the right just for a moment. And the first is around no compromise on safety, which we will talk about today, productivity, which we will talk about today, and experience. And really, for example, whilst many of us can work from home well, are we really as productive as we are, as we could be? is the experience really as good as it could be? And the answer is, for most organizations, there's a little bit of room to improve. And therefore, having this principle-oriented approach is really powerful. In the middle, the principle of having the flexibility to shift and scale capacity and resources is really important. And using intent-based networking, using automation and assurance, such that we're able to do this in a closed-loop fashion, is a fundamental capability within Cisco platforms and within DNA Center specifically. And that is a key enabler to be able to move these resources as demand changes. And certainly then, as we look forward and look into how do we develop new capabilities, this is going to rely, for example, on the use of APIs, the use of analytics, the ability to tie what were previously disparate systems together in new ways to drive new value chains. And we're already seeing that today as we return to work. And we'll talk about some examples today of how we tie these different systems together as this new need of returning to the office arises. I'm not going to talk about business policies and operating model today. That is a broad topic, and in this short conversation we leave that. But this principles-oriented approach with this new mindset gives us a starting place for our strategy. And then as we start to move beyond the formation of the business strategy, and again, the business strategy is far broader than those principles, but for the purposes of today, if we have this principle-oriented resilience strategy, the question then is, how do we develop the corresponding network strategy to map that? And there are many capabilities that the network can bring to deliver on this. I've talked about a couple, for example, around APIs and automation and assurance, and the team will talk about these in more detail today. But if we look at these from the context, or in the context of use cases, there are really a bunch of 4 or 5 core fundamental use cases that the network needs to deliver resilience and to specifically enable return to office. The first of those is one that was one of the earliest that has been developed by everybody in the market, right? By everybody in their own organizations, I should say, around enabling a secure remote workforce. Now, again, when we take those principles of experience and productivity, this is more than just a VPN. This is about becoming as productive, if not more productive, if not as secure, then becoming more secure than in the office. So there's a lot to that. We're not talking about that one so much specifically today, but the second one we are, which is about enabling safe return to workplaces. And when we talk about that principle of no compromise to employee safety or experience, this one becomes really important. I talked about new behaviors, for example, new expectations that have become the norm for us, whether it be around close proximity to others, whether it be around, from a business perspective, what's going to become a new norm is optimization of our business environments, optimization of the space. As users then having the right understanding of who's in a space before we enter it, using wayfinding, for example, as the right way to safely navigate, all of these become critical capabilities to enable this return to office. And then beyond that, then some of these will be serviced via the cloud. And indeed, what you'll be hearing about today is an example of one of those that is serviced by the cloud. And again, there's a big conversation around the use of cloud that's beyond the scope of today's conversation, but certainly two that are really important, and certainly these are really within the wheelhouse of what DNA and DNA Center can bring to you, is this concept of automated operations for fast recovery and the use of analytics for smarter insights. And indeed today, you'll hear all about how we use these insights to drive these new experiences. So this is fundamentally the use cases that will be delivered by the network. But this network forms part of a broader business resilience architecture that we have been developing within Cisco, and that many of our customers are starting to build and embrace, where we tie many of these elements together. So today we're going to be talking more around these two here, which are around the use of mobility and Wi-Fi and APIs and DNA spaces on top of a wireless infrastructure powered by DNA and DNA Center. But beyond that, the integration with other capabilities. So for example, a really, really important integration for the return to work or return to office scenario is the integration with collaborative systems, the integration with digital signage. And when we start to tie all these things together, great things can happen. But then building beyond that, building in the right zero trust network access strategy to allow better mobility as people move in these hybrid environments powered by multi-factor authentication and new forms of security right through to the cloud itself. So again, I'm really just laying out the overall landscape. I'm broadening the conversation because this will effectively become the IT strategy for most organizations, empowered by this business strategy with this new framework of thinking, this new mindset based on these principles. So again, while we are talking about some elements of this today, know that this is a bigger capability and that we would love to work with you more closely beyond today's webinar. So with that, I'm going to hand the ball back to James, and he will take you through his section, and we'll move through the remainder of the webinar. So thank you.